Hi, and welcome to Something to Talk About. I'm Linda McNamee, and as you saw from the introduction, for the next hour, we are going to be talking about history. And not just any history, it's going to be some special stuff, so you'll want to hang out for that. But we are live this evening, so if you have a question for my wonderful guest, whom you will meet momentarily, you can always give us a call at 781-270, I always forget the number, 9199. I never call because I'm here. If you have a question for our guest after the fact, or if you have a suggestion for a future topic, you are more than welcome to email me at talk@bcattv.org. So, what's next? Oh, we need to thank the crew for this evening. Chris Flaherty, who is one of the staff members here, makes sure that us volunteers behave ourselves and don't burn the place down, which we haven't done yet. So Chris makes sure that everybody stays professional and makes sure that us volunteers know what we're doing. And I should switch things around, saying there is no daddy date night tonight because once again, my son Evan is crewing for this evening. Evan is getting really good at being a director. So thank you, Evan, for hanging out at BCAT tonight and helping out your mom. So now it is time to meet my wonderful guest. He might be familiar to some of you, but we have Alan Foulds, who is a historian. And historian?
And historian.
And
sure.
historian.
I like that.
And a podcast host and producer.
That's
And
right.
after I did this sheet, I also found that you're a published author too. So we have a lot to talk
All
about
sorts
tonight.
of things, yes.
So, well, thank you for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you
And
for having me.
as I like to start each show is just get to know my guest a little bit better. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and how you came to the Burlington area?
All right. Well, I grew up in Linfield, not too far away,
Not too
7
far
or 8
away.
miles down the road. It's where I went to school all the way through high school. I have been in the town of Reading, though, for the last 41 years.
Oh, excellent.
And how I got to Burlington and BCAT. Well, I always known Burlington. It's nearby. When I went to Northeastern, my freshman year, was at the Burlington campus, so it was probably my first
Oh,
connection.
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
As far as BCAT, it all started maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I know you're the director of BCAT very well. We are in the same running club. One year you had a contest for moderator. You had two people running against each other who were probably your most logical candidates to run the debate.
The debate.
So they are, of course, both ineligible. Jen, the director, knew that I'm the moderator in Reading, so she called me up and asked if I would be interested in running this debate. And I said, sure. And I just never went away.
Well, I'm glad to have you. And now we're just pulling you in.
Yeah.
You know, we caught you, now we're reeling you
That's
in for
right,
more
right.
stuff. Because you had also said, in addition to moderating that debate, you've done some other things around BCAT, haven't you?
Yes, I have. I co-host the election coverage along with Rich Hosford on your local elections. I've done that for about the same length of time, 6 or 7 years or so. And
Live election.
Yeah.
And now,
I am a podcast
because
broadcaster.
you found out we have a brand new podcast room.
That's right. It is great, by the way.
So I know, I'm already off track. Can we talk about podcasting itself? Because, I mean, where does it go? I mean, is it just an online thing? Is it kind of like a verbal blog or something?
In a way, I almost look at it as on-demand radio. It's a way you can pick a show or subject and listen to it whenever you want. You could be out running, in fact, doing it. Download it to your whatever gadget you've got and listen to it running, or you can listen to it on your phone or your computer or whatever, whenever you want. And also, it's good because anybody can do it. And you have a subject that's got a niche audience, do it.
So how do you find your audience? Is it just like coming up with catchy titles for a search engine? Or?
That's part of it, yeah. You get as many keywords out there
the
so people
tags.
start looking for things like history or that type of thing, and then people come find you. Also, you know, you go through social media, Facebook and other places to let people know you exist, and you know, you post it here and somebody else posts it there, and before you know it,
Gotta love sharing.
yeah, it's all over the place.
Sure.
Yeah.
So how did you become interested in history? Because growing up, I was terrified of history.
I think it's one of those things, it's either in your genes or it isn't. I've always been interested in history. I have to credit a couple of people in my life that really sort of lit the spark. One was my 6th grade teacher, of all people. As I said, I grew up in the town of Linfield. He, Mr. Cox, was from an old-time family. I think his great-great-grandfather started the Cox Farm, which had long since been taken over by 128. But he knew everything about the town, so he was always talking about these historical things, and I would have to go find him when he talked about it.
Oh, cool.
And the other one was my uncle, Sam Foulds. He was a sports historian in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, particularly with soccer. He wrote a book on soccer in the United States, all the way back to 1890s.
Okay.
And as he got older, I started doing the legwork for him, and I got caught up in the subject as well.
Did you like soccer?
Oh, yes. It's our family sport. I played soccer as a kid. I played it in high school.
Cool.
My brother, my sister, my father, all my uncles on both sides of the family. It's almost like a cult back then, but we all did it.
Now, there's history that you learn in school, and you're reading the history books. And then there's those little-known facts, like, we were talking earlier about which president didn't want squirrels in the White House, or, Taft got stuck in a bathtub. Little-known facts that, as your podcast title explains, it's also history. But what made you go into the lesser-known facts?
Partly because it's easy to find the big known facts. I'm interested in that as well, by the way. I have books on the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the Mayflower and the witch trials and so forth. But we have so much big-time history around here. Some of the smaller things just kind of forgotten. And I get caught up in a couple of them. For example, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, my first podcast here, it starts on April 19th, but it isn't about what's going on Lexington Green. It's the story of what Paul Revere and John Hancock were doing with the provincial Congress records, running out through the woods to try to get them away from the British troops. In fact, Burlington figures into the story.
Yeah.
They went to a house right here, right where the Burlington Mall parking lot is now.
Oops.
But that's the kind of
darn mall.
Yeah.
No, we love them all. We love them all.
But that's the kind of story that interests me, the things that were going on. Obviously, there were other stuff happening.
So how do you find this stuff? Because if not too many people, history is what people write down and then you can go back and refer to.
Right.
But if it's so little known.
That's what makes it fun. I'm pretty good at going down rabbit holes. Maybe sometimes I don't want to, but I end up doing that anyway.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I was doing research for a book, and this is back before newspapers were all online, so I was spending a lot of time in the basement of the Boston Public Library going through microfilm. But it was like being in a time machine.
Oh my gosh, I remember microfiche.
Yeah, twirling and
zoom in.
But it was like being in a time machine. One example I had was I was looking for one subject, but I got caught up in something else I happened to catch on. It was there was a fire in Everett back in the 1920s or 30s.
Okay.
So I started reading about it. And then later on in the night, I happened to mention to my wife, asking if she'd heard anything more about this fire in Everett, forgetting that it was 80 years ago. But I had read all of this, and it felt new to me. It just felt like I was back there in that time. So that's part of it. You go down rabbit holes. You find side stories as you're looking for other ones.
Now, one thing that, when I was listening to your podcast, but also just kind of thinking about what we could talk about tonight, and it just kind of occurred to me, yes, we talked about the big news stories and the big history stories that we learn about, and then the lesser known facts. But is there a line between lesser known facts and trivia?
Well, there is, but I think trivia is in the eye of the beholder. It depends on what you are interested in. I like these little side stories. Admittedly, some of them do border on minutia. Obscure, right. But other ones are not. Like another example, one of my podcasts, there was a major train disaster in Revere in 1872.
Okay.
I came across...
Didn't listen to that one.
Came across that reading a history book about something, and it references the Revere Disaster. That's all it said. It didn't say what kind of a disaster it was, but it acted as though you already knew what it was, but you probably did back when the book was written, back in the 1890s or sometime. And my parents and grandparents came from Revere, so I had an interest in that. So I had to go digging. What's this Revere disaster? And I found some old newspapers. I did find an old history of the Eastern Railroad that was probably written in the 1930s, 1940s.
Oh, wow.
And there was this story about this terrible train crash where it actually, you have to listen to the podcast for the whole story, but there was a big battle between the Eastern Railroad and the Boston and Maine at the time.
Okay.
Boston and Maine was more of the forward-thinking company. The Eastern Railroad, they did things the old way. They didn't want to get involved with this newfangled telegraph because something could go wrong with it. You had to depend on timetables, nothing else.
Exactly.
Well, that all worked.
This has worked. That's always worked. This is how we're going to do it.
And it worked until it didn't. And it caused this awful disaster. So this story about this disaster is one of my topics. Now, that's big news. That's not trivia, but it's something that most people don't know about.
Yeah, it's just forgot. Now, as you were telling us that story, it made me think about, yes, you had mentioned that everything's digitized now, everything's online. But before, it was just newspapers and microfiche. And newspapers from the 1800s and 1910s, 1920s, has that all made it online, or can you still access, like, going to a town hall and researching town records? Because
a little of both.
History is a long time, so how does it all
it's amazing
uploaded?
Amazing how much is out there, but there's not everything. You do have to go searching. In addition to newspapers, I have found diaries and journals of people for some of the subjects I've looked on.
Where do you find those?
Let's see, Harvard Library, Houghton Library. Harvard has a lot of them. The PEM in Salem is another great resource. Massachusetts Historical Society, I'm a member there, so it makes it a little easier.
Yeah.
And they have a wealth of information.
Talking about trivia, things that I didn't even know, and they're not even trivial. They're like Peabody Essex Museum.
Yes.
Oh, who knew?
Yeah, right.
So, wow. Okay. What's the furthest back in history that you've ever gone?
Well, right now, it's probably 1620, which I have a story about the Mayflower. Now, again, I don't want to give everything away.
Coming onto your podcast.
Yes.
That one hasn't been done yet, has it?
Yes, it has.
It has?
Yes, that was an early one.
Oh,
I don't tell a story about the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock.
Well,
you can
'cause
find that
everybody
out
knows,
easily enough, and you probably know it. I wanted to know what happened to the ship. It couldn't have been the only trip it ever made, so I wanted to know, does it still exist? And then, the background. Who was the captain? Almost nobody. You hear of Miles Standish and John Winthrop. Who was the captain? So I went into a little of those side stories.
Okay.
And where was I going? Oh, that's the farthest back I've gone so far.
Okay.
But it's not the farthest back that I want to. I have a real interest in the indigenous history of this area.
Oh, okay.
Everybody knows it exists, but very few people know much about the fact that we had...
Other than it exists.
Yeah, highly... real civilizations with their own governments and their own villages, and we know almost nothing about them. Massachusetts had its own language, the Massachusetts language. It's
cool.
practically disappeared, but they were here. So I'd like to go farther back, but it is hard to get records.
Understood. Because a lot of times, and again, history is not my strong suit, but the code breakers, I remember seeing, was it World War II? That they had the Native Americans' language because it was never written down.
Yes, that's right.
So I'm kind of curious what kind of obstacles you will find with the history if nothing was ever written down, or very limited things were written down.
I've already run into that. I'm having some trouble. I'm not giving up by any means, but
can't give up.
I've already found some of the names of the villages from around here. So getting a start into it, and I'll keep working on that. That podcast won't be around for a while.
You got to research it.
Yes,
but it seems like what we've talked about and seeing some of the topics on your podcast, or of the 10 episodes that you've done already, it's all local. Do you like sticking to Massachusetts? And did you ever think about expanding?
Well, I do. You know why? I like history that I can feel and go see. and that makes it easy.
That
It's
personal
actually all of
connection.
New England, but to be honest, it is mostly eastern Massachusetts. But I've had one as far west as Stockbridge, another one as far north as Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, which is about as far north in New Hampshire as you can get.
Oh, okay.
I've spread out a little, but there are places that I can go and see. Now, right down the street from me, you might consider trivia rather than history.
Ah, no.
Right down the street from where I live, back in 1897 to 1917, there was a fairground, the Quantapowhat Agricultural Fairgrounds.
Oh, okay.
Nobody knows much about it. I mean, it's a lot like what the Topsfield Fair is today, but a
Oh,
little
okay.
bit smaller. But there are dozens and dozens of photographs. It's all houses now, but I like going down there and trying to find the exact spots where these photographs were taken
cool.
from. And it's just, I can almost imagine there was the
I
grandstand.
know a lot of people that like try doing that.
Is that right?
You know, finding a photograph and seeing if they can like reproduce it
Produce it
somehow.
right for a modern picture.
Yeah.
I like knowing that the grandstand was here, the racetrack was over here, and
Well, in Newton, isn't there like the Norumbega
Norumbega Park. Yeah.
Park?
Yeah.
Okay, I just remember the sign, but
I actually went there as a very young child. I have vague memories of it, but I actually went to that park.
Cool. Was it like an amusement park?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I just
Yeah,
remember
small scale. It wasn't Disney World, but
No,
it was
no.
small scale.
Disney World's built on a swamp, so you
Right,
know, hey,
right.
100 years ago it wasn't even around. So, history is something that you're really interested in.
Yes.
That you like to research, you like to dive down those rabbit holes, and thankfully you like to come out of those rabbit holes. What made you decide to want to tell these stories and make them better known instead of just, oh, that's cool and doing great on Jeopardy?
Well, I figure I like them. There's got to be other people like me. If I didn't do this podcast, if somebody else had, I would be probably the first person to sign up to listen to it.
Cool.
But why these particular stories? Well, a few years ago I wrote a book, and I've thought about writing more than that. So whenever I get, I think, as a good subject, something that is fairly local but unknown, I write it down and put what notes I have to it. Some of them pan out, some of them don't. Some of them are in between, where they're not a book, but it's still worth telling. Along came BCAT's podcast studios.
How convenient.
What a great place to do this. What a great outlet.
So tell me more about your book, though.
Oh, back in 2005, a book I published at UPNE, University Press of New England, called Boston's Ballparks and Arenas. It's a history of all of the professional sports venues in Greater Boston since 1871. Everybody, even non-sports people, know about Fenway
everyone
and
knows
the
about
Garden and Foxborough, Gillette Stadium. But, you know,
So this is like all sports.
this is all sports, yeah.
Okay.
So the average sports person might know that the Red Sox used to play at the Huntington Avenue grounds. They might know that we used to have a national team, the Boston Braves, that had their own couple of fields.
Okay.
But there was far more than that. We had two teams back in the 1890s that were both startup leagues trying to fight the National League. And they each built their own stadium in Boston.
Trying to imagine now where you would put
I
a second stadium.
I know. Well,
It's
we
like,
have
wow.
the New England Revolution, which is trying to find a spot to build its own stadium, and it's hard to do nowadays. But back then, you know, they were filling in the Back Bay, they were filling in the Fenway, and there was more open land to use.
Okay.
One of the teams built its stadium in South Boston, over where the Seaport District is now.
Wow.
But up until even 15, 20 years ago, that was pretty much wasteland, parking lots and empty lots. So that's where they built their stadium.
Oh, wild.
Yeah, so this is, and then more sports. Basketball. Most people don't realize that we had two professional basketball teams before the
Really?
Celtics.
Okay.
And they both started at Boston Arena, which still exists today. It's now Matthews Arena at Northeastern.
Oh.
And it's actually the oldest indoor ice arena in the world now.
Wow.
And so both of those teams started, as did the Celtics and the Bruins. They started there before the first Garden was built. But they went on to other places when they couldn't afford the high rent there. One of them ending up in a Knights of Columbus Hall in Somerville.
Really?
Now, maybe that borders on trivia, but it interests me that they played in a place that still exists. It's now I think it's a liquor store and Dunkin' Donuts.
Oh, yeah, there you go. There you go. Another history of Dunkin' Donuts, you know, where they all popped out. No, that would be trivia. So how did you figure out that there would be enough to write a book? And
Well, I found
Did you talk
out,
about the teams or just the parks?
well,
or
the history of the teams had to come into it, but it really is a history of the venues. That was the main purpose of this, because that hadn't really been written, other than Fenway Park itself. There's a lot of books on that. But some of these other ones, especially the lesser-known ones, a lot of people didn't even know they existed at all.
Well, I think Fenway, because it's still there.
It's still
everybody
there,
knows
right,
about
right.
It, but
And then Braves Field partially still exists. That's it's BU's Nickerson Field now. About a third of it still exists.
Okay.
The front of it and the
oh, so they were able to keep some of it?
yes.
Oh, neat.
After the Braves moved to originally to Milwaukee before they went on to Atlanta,
Oh,
the
didn't
land
know
was
that.
sold to Boston University, and it became BU's field for a while. And they
Okay.
took part of it to build some dorms, but they kept another part and sort of reconfigured things.
Okay.
But the original right field stands are still there, and the
Wow.
facade, the front facade, is still there.
cool.
So that's the kind of story that ends up in the book.
And now it's time to make a movie out of them.
Right.
Podcast? No.
Podcast. Well, one piece of that, one chapter of the book did get in as a podcast so far.
Oh, cool.
Just really quickly, Boston.
No.
Boston
Got plenty of time.
Plenty of time. Boston had another stadium that virtually nobody knows about. I think that I'm the person who rediscovered this.
Cool.
It was a stadium built with the hopes of attracting a black baseball team, a Negro League team.
Okay.
And they never really made it. They never got a big-time team to move in, but they did have a series of minor league teams that played there.
okay.
It only existed for 5 or 6 years, and it came almost as fast as it went.
Wow.
And there's no signs of it. Actually, when I was writing the book, I took a walk around the neighborhood to ask if anybody knew anything about this. And of course, it has been 60 years or so there weren't really anybody around that was
many,
down
yeah.
there. There was one guy that I found, his family business, he's in his 80s now, his family business was right nearby. And as a kid, he used to run around the neighborhood, but he had no recollection of it. It was too bad.
Oh,
He was the
wow.
closest I came to finding somebody that knew about
Oh,
it.
wow. That must be pretty cool. So when you're researching and you discover these little known facts, kind of two questions. How do you figure out that there is enough to continue on to tell the story? And how do you frame that story? How do you figure out how to make it more interesting than just facts?
Good question. What I do
Or
anytime...
it could just be your personality because you know, you're a great storyteller.
Oh,
so
thank you. Well, anytime I hear something that sounds even vaguely interesting, I'll make some notes and just put it in my file, and I'll get back to it. Then I'll start doing some digging. Sometimes they just don't pan out. Sometimes what I've heard is all there is, and there isn't any story to tell. Sometimes there is something to tell, so I just dig deeper and deeper. I look to find people that might know something about this. First-person interviews is the best of all, but in the eras that I'm looking at.
Although, 1620
Yeah,
might be
I
kind of
haven't
hard
found
to
too many
find,
people around for that.
eyewitnesses.
But in some cases, it doesn't work, but it leads me somewhere else.
Okay.
Perfect example, if you don't mind me saying, that the newest podcast that went up today, it's about an assassination attempt at the State House. Somebody tried to kill the governor.
Wow.
Well,
when was this?
This was in 1907.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure it's not recent.
And he survived, and he actually became one of the heroes of the day, actually stopping the assassin. But I didn't start off looking for that. I had found some facts about that particular governor that I thought would be interesting. Didn't really work, but while I was looking, I found this assassination attempt. I said, oh my, I didn't never even heard of this. And I don't think anybody has. It seems like I've never heard of anybody else talking about it.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty neat.
Yeah.
So what, you've been telling a lot of, actually, I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking, have you ever thought about being a duck tour driver? Because I think, they have like a book that thick of all history, and it's like little known facts. And they say whenever you go on a duck tour, it's never going to be the same information from one trip to the next. But out of everything that you've researched, other than the stories you've told us about, what is one of your favorite stories or favorite discoveries?
Okay, one of my favorite discoveries, actually, it predates the podcast, but it may end up being one at some point. Back in 1975, as the National Bicentennial was heating up,
Okay.
The revolution started here, so the bicentennial started here.
Of course.
I was doing some research trying to put together not just Paul Revere, Dawes, and Prescott, but the entire network of midnight riders that ran through the countryside.
So it wasn't just the two of them?
No, I found like 20 to 25. Wow. What I started doing was, I'd heard a couple of side stories about this, and I thought, well, that makes sense. How did all these people get there? 3 people couldn't have done it.
Yeah.
So I said, there's got to be others. I knew of one in particular, and I thought, other towns have to have these. So I started piecing together these stories. Then I also got maps from that era, as close to 1775 as I could,
Okay.
and I built an Eastern Massachusetts map of
Cool.
1775 so I could see where the logical routes would be.
Okay.
And in the middle of all of this, I found a story in the town of Westford. It was in a history book written in the 1890s, but the quote came from a diary from back in the 1700s. It was almost poetic the way it worded about this mysterious mounted messenger riding into town, telling of the British advance. His name is forgotten to history, but his words ring through time, or something like
Okay.
that. Anyway,
That does sound very
so
poetic.
okay, that's interesting. I know this guy came in.
Okay.
Oh, in fact, it talked about coming up over the Beaver Brook Bridge into town.
Oh, okay.
So I thought that makes a nice story, but I got to find out who this was. Yeah. Well, over in Littleton, the Littleton Library, I read a book over there. Very matter-of-factly, the militia commander sent Edward Weatherby over the Beaver Brook Bridge to Westford. And there it was, just like that.
There it
I
was.
had his name, and they didn't have it in Westford.
Oh, cool.
So
Are you ever able to like follow up and fill
Oh
in the
yeah, I
blanks?
actually was able to fill in exactly where he went to and so forth. Yeah.
Cool.
So like I said, I found one guy that he met Paul Revere in Medford Center, rode up through Stoneham into what is today Wakefield and Reading, and then North Reading, and then over to Linfield.
Okay.
So I can trace
And you're like,
almost
hey,
to the
I
roads.
know where that is.
Right, I can trace
That's how I
almost
get
to the
to
roads.
work.
You're right. Yeah. So
Okay,
I
well, maybe not, but
so I found his name and his whole family history and everything, and what happened to him later on in life, and it was interesting. So I was able to piece together several of these guys, and at least one woman, by the way. I shouldn't say guys.
yeah, I remember. What was her name?
I am blanking on it, but it was in Lincoln, in the
I
town
am
of Lincoln.
blanking on
Yeah,
it too,
yeah.
but yeah, it's like you go to
Yeah.
the national park and they're like, hey, there was a woman
That's
there too, but it
right,
was like
yeah.
Paul Revere and
Yeah.
her. I'm totally forgetting her name. Listening to you talk about the Littleton and Westford and everything and drawing the maps, I keep thinking of like my field trips just to the national park over Minuteman National Park. And they have a map and they have the little dotted lines and, through the little video. Have you ever partnered with like the national parks, or do they stick more with the big stories, or?
Well, they stick more with the big stories, although parts of that story I just told are on a map over there.
Okay.
It was a book written a few years later, David Hackett Fisher, very good book, by the way, called Paul Revere's Ride. And he did a lot of the same type of thing I did. He came up with some slightly different conclusions, but basically he did that too. And so they've got a map over there of 9 to 10 of these riders that went out through the countryside. So I personally have not partnered with them, but they do know some of these side stories.
Do they also have resources for you to do more of your digging, or? Because I see them as kind of an all is said and done type. This is what we have, where like the Littleton Library has, all of those books hidden in.
Right. I went to as close to the source as I could get. Of course, obviously, again, nobody's around from 1775, but there
If they are, you'd want to stay away from them.
Yeah, but there are diaries. Another example from that story, I found a diary of Loami Baldwin from Woburn. And I actually got to see his original writing at the Houghton Library at Harvard. And very matter-of-factly talking about the express rider coming in from Cambridge, from Stedman in Cambridge, telling me of the British advance before going on to Tewkesbury, I think it was.
Wow.
So it was just fun. It was almost like I was talking to this guy. It was
Cool.
as close as you can get to talking to him.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
With some of your favorite stories, and we're also and we can go into this a little more too. After you first published your book, you went and you were talking to audiences, and even, podcasts, you don't really interact with people.
Right.
But with some of your interacting and some of your storytelling, has there ever been like any memorable moment interacting with another person based on what you were telling them?
In a way, one that comes to mind, it was actually sort of a failed talk of all things, but it's one of my most memorable. It was a book talk I was doing at the Boston Public Library about the Ballparks book.
Okay.
And something happened, and the word never got put in their newsletter, so not many people knew what was happening.
Okay.
I had, I think, 4 people show up to it, but 3 of them were from the Society of American Baseball Research. Bill Nowlin, you might have heard the name. He's a fairly well-known author around here. He used to own Rounders Records and Rounders books.
Okay.
And we just had this great 2-hour talk. He was interested in my stuff. I was interested in what he had to say, and I learned so much from them. All from what I considered sort of a failed talk. It was one of the few that just didn't go right. And usually
it's one of those rabbit holes.
That's right, it was. Normally I'd have 20 to 100 people, and this time I had 4, but they couldn't have been more interesting.
Oh, neat. Now, what are some of the other places that you've been to talk? Was it just about your book, or did you also talk about like?
The combination. I had a lot of talks on the book. Basketball Hall of Fame I spoke at, a place in White Plains, New York, of all places. I asked the guy, I said, why are you inviting me? I said, I'm a Red Sox fan. He says, oh, we're not Yankees fans. We're Mets fans here, so you're okay with
Mets
us.
fans are okay, yes.
I've also given a lot of talks to historical societies on the Midnight Rider alarm system. So I've done the circuit.
Cool. Yeah, when you were talking about, sports arenas and baseball or basketball, I actually grew up out in Western Mass. So, the Basketball Hall of Fame was in my backyard practically.
Yeah.
And the Volleyball Hall of Fame is
Volleyball in Holyoke,
next town over. Yeah, exactly. So it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. And, the Peach Basket Parade where they were talking about, the origins of the basketball game where it was a peach.
It's a podcast.
Basket. For you.
Yeah.
Because remember, I don't like history. What is this, so going back to my questions and just kind of, what is the weirdest or strangest fact? Or most, the strangest that you remember?
Well,
or, the most bizarre fact, like, oh my gosh.
I don't know if it's a bizarre fact or not, but the one I just talked about the assassination attempt on the governor, to me it was bizarre that I didn't know about that everybody didn't know about it.
Right.
And it just shocked me. I actually went back into looking at several old newspapers to get the story. And of course it was big news back in 1907, and yet it's fairly forgotten today. And one weird thing that does come out of that, one of the 3 people who were shot that day, a survivor, one of the 3 that actually survived, was in another shooting incident 18 years later where he was having dinner with 3 people. A guy came in and shot the 3 of them, and he survived again because the bullet...
Somebody holds a grudge.
And somebody was looking out for him, too. The bullet lodged into a notebook that he had in his pocket. So he survived again.
I've heard like a lot of stories of
yes.
like the bullets.
Actually, Teddy Roosevelt was giving a speech once, and
Yes.
that very thing happened in Milwaukee. Yeah.
Was that his?
It's funny you say, how far have you gone? Well, I was on a business trip in Milwaukee. I had to go find that spot where that happened.
Did you find it?
Yes, oh yeah. There's even a plaque on the wall. So in some ways, it's the fun out of it. Oh, I didn't discover this.
Somebody else got here first. So we've talked about your book, and we've talked about the podcast a little bit. What is your thought process to determine whether or not something is entertaining or of value enough to create a podcast? How long, what are the criteria that you must meet before you're like, yeah, I'm going to do a podcast on this?
Well, a lot of that comes from the research and how much I can find on the story. Some of these stories, like I said earlier, some of them just don't pan out. I'm thinking, I've told a story in 2 minutes. It's not really that interesting. Or maybe it turns out to be not as exciting as I thought it might be. A lot of it comes after I've dug into them for a while. And then I think, okay, this has promise. I try to keep the podcast to around 15 minutes, anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes, because I think any longer it begins to drag them out a little bit. But like quick snippets. And if I can't fill 15 minutes, then or if I have to stretch it to make it work, it's not a good podcast.
Do you ever think about writing like a book series?
You know, I have thought about at some point maybe turning these into a book, maybe even calling it It's Also History, the same name as the podcast.
Like a little novella or something, or even a kid's book, you know, getting into the schools or something.
I will tell you one side story. One of the podcasts I actually turned into a fiction piece for Alfred Hitchcock magazine. And I didn't...
Cool.
The podcast is real fact. But I took the basics and basically added a what if. What if this had happened? And I wrote this story in it for Alfred Hitchcock magazine a couple of years ago. This actually predates the podcast, but I had already done the research knowing at some point I'd do something with the story.
What was the fact and what was the what if?
There was a disappearance of a woman back in 1961 from the town of Lincoln. It was big news for at least a year. She was a mother of two, stay-at-home mother. And she just vanished without a trace, and was never found, by the way. There's never been an answer to it. So I thought, well, what if this happened? What if this was the answer? And I kind of took it from there. I didn't use it. It's not the same story, but I just used that as the basis for writing this story. I wasn't trying to solve the mystery. I just thought this would be kind of a fun
what
story.
What would happen if she were found?
Right. That's
found alive versus
exactly.
not alive.
Yeah, it's close enough where she could be. I mean, she'd be about 90 right now. It's
neat.
But so that's how the story went. Anyway, so I have somewhat written a little piece of it. But as far as the actual factual stories, I have given some thought that maybe this becomes a book someday.
Well, because I'm also thinking, like in Burlington, when my daughter was in 3rd grade. And I think, you know, other years as well, the 3rd graders were learning about local history, and they did a tour of Burlington's local history.
Oh, yeah.
So they went to the museum, they went to the Francis Wyman House, they went to Grandview Farm, and they learned about that specific history. And I'm thinking, well, my son, who is only 2 years younger than that, was never able to do that field trip. So I'm thinking, you know, it'd be really cool to have like some of these stories in younger kid form that they could actually learn and then maybe get interested and do their own digging.
It's a good idea. As I said at the start, it was a 6th grade teacher that really set me on this path.
Go. So what are your future plans for your podcast?
Well, I pretty much more of the same. I'd like to keep it going on an every other week basis.
Okay.
I might hone it down a little bit, maybe either change the length, either a little bit longer, a little shorter, whatever I think works. It's kind of still in its experimental stage.
Okay.
But there isn't anything yet that I would say, I wish I'd done it this way, but that may happen the longer I go. But I would like to keep it going, and like I said, maybe at some point publish them.
Do you have like themes that you like to do, like you know, like subdivisions, like let's do a whole mini series on the sports arenas, and then another one just on the Revolutionary War tangents? Or
it's not a bad idea. Right now, I'm mixing things up. I haven't told any of the stories of the Midnight Riders yet, although that will appear. I have told one of the sports stories, but a lot of these are new things that I've thought about writing. Like I think I might have said earlier, things that might have become a book, but aren't quite there. They're not long enough for a book, but are still interesting. So I'd like to keep going on that that vein. What was I going to say? I like to mix it up a little bit. I don't want to have all revolution, or I don't want to have all.
You want to like diversify your
disasters or whatever, right?
Thing.
So
disasters would be cool.
Yeah. Well, I did tell the one about the trains, the Revere Disaster. There's another one that's coming up on a nightclub in Boston that everybody has heard about, the Coconut Grove, even if they don't know the details. But there was another disaster like that called the Pickwick Club, where the top floor actually pancaked down to the third, second, first, right down to the basement, and it was a pretty bad, terrible thing. Scores of people get killed.
When was that?
That was back in 1925 on the 4th of July.
Okay.
But it doesn't get the publicity because, of course, this Coconut Grove was 492 people later on. And I'm sure you've heard of the molasses flood.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's sort
Fill
of...
us in about the molasses flood for those people who haven't heard about.
Well, in 1919, a molasses tank in the North End burst. And you don't think of drowning in molasses, you think it's too slow, but this, of course, is superheated, and it was like a rush of, almost like a wave coming down through the city, and it just drowned people within seconds.
And I think they said sometimes, depending on like the weather, you can still smell molasses.
Whether it's real or imagined, the people are smelling it.
100 years old.
Yeah. Now, there's a great book on that subject, so that's taken.
Okay.
Dark Tide by Stephen Polio. Very good book.
Ooh.
It reads like a novel. It really does. But he must have the same interests that I do.
That's
you
pretty
take a subject
cool.
like that and you find out about it.
You mentioned that when you start doing research and you come across one of these little tidbits of information that sound interesting, you put it on a little note. And then you keep going, you put something on a little note. Have you thought about, or have you taken those and started writing like the stories before it gets to the journal to figure out how to get something written? You know, because I'm just looking at my notes going, what would it take to create a written journal of your podcast stories?
I usually don't start the writing until I've decided this is a good story.
Okay.
Like there's enough here to write. The writing part for me has always been the easiest part. It's the research, which is the most fun, but it's also the hardest.
Right.
And digging and digging to find out if there's really anything here. So what I do, like you said, is I keep notes. I just keep notes until I think, all right, this is worth diving into. And then once I've got them lined up, I just decide, how can I best tell the story? How can I make this interesting? And then the writing, like I said, comes fairly fast.
Cool. Now, I don't know if I asked this or not, but, you know, just glancing down, because we do have some time left. Before you started your podcast, that's now on episode 10,
Yeah, 11, I think, actually.
11,
today,
okay.
Yep.
It's been a couple of days since I
Yes, just this afternoon.
So there you go. Okay, so I don't feel so bad. What did you do with all those stories?
I told them to my friends, anybody who would listen.
Anybody who would listen. No, I wasn't sure, like, if you went to the historical societies or libraries that you went to for book promotion and just told these other stories. Or...
The exceptions to that, of course, have been my book and then the Midnight Rider story. I did tell that to a lot of historical societies and that type of thing, especially back during anniversaries or around Patriots' Day.
That's right. I think, I just read on B News that they're thinking about starting planning for the
250th.
250.
Right.
Is it 250? Oh,
yeah, imagine that.
Oh my gosh, now I feel really old. 250. Have you ever thought about, planning something for that?
Yes, actually, I am hoping there's a group called Revolution 250 that it's a sort of a consortium of groups around Greater Boston that want to start planning for this. And I'm involved in a couple of local historical societies, and I'm trying to urge them to take this on, to have some local piece of that story and be part of the big celebration.
What would you like to see that celebration look like?
Well, I don't know about the whole thing, but I would like to recreate the ride of Martin Herrick, the guy that met Paul Revere in Medford, up through Stoneham and Wakefield and Reading and Linfield, and I think it would be kind of a nice thing. I could actually see the cable access studios getting involved with that, reporting it as it went along. It's in its planning. I mean, it's early thought. It's like I'm still putting little notes down to see if it'll work.
How do you keep your notes? Is it like all in notebooks?
It's all in MS Word. I
Okay.
put a document out on my laptop.
I'm also thinking, depending on how long you do this, or how long you've been doing it, technology changes so fast that, I used to store everything on a 5.25 inch disc.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have anything that can read that disc now? Or even before, Microsoft came out, there were other, I don't even remember any of them now, any of the word processing programs that have you ever lost material because of technological
I
changes?
haven't, but I do have kind of a sad story like that. I used to work with a woman who was a great storyteller. She just was one of these people I love to have lunch with because she'd always have some great story. And unfortunately, she got very sick, and in her last days, she gave me this stack of 3 1/4-inch discs and said, "You're the person who would most want these." She died a couple of weeks later, and I haven't been able to find out how to read them since then. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but I just have not.
Got to stop at your local library. They have everything.
They have everything. Yeah.
They have everything.
But that's exactly. You're right. That's what happens. So far, I haven't had that problem. I guess I'd have to do something about it before that happened.
I think it was Word Perfect or something.
Word Perfect. Yeah, I remember that.
Is that the name of it?
In fact, I believe these were written in Word Perfect on 3 1/4-inch flop, those little tiny ones.
Yeah, the little tiny ones that were like, it wasn't
3.5
floppy
maybe.
anymore because it was a hard case.
Right.
Although inside it was.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, because technology changes, and a long time ago, I worked at GBH, and they had a huge archiving department, and they were trying to preserve video footage and everything because technology changes so fast that I don't want you to lose your valuable research.
Well, BCAT has some of them now.
That's true, but what if technology changes again?
Yes, I know.
Because for a while it was like, oh my gosh, we have everything on disc. What are we going to do if we can no longer read those? And here we are, and I don't know if that was ever answered.
I know, it is an issue. You have to just stay on it and be diligent and keep upgrading whenever you have to. Unfortunately, it's getting both fortunately and unfortunately, it's getting faster and faster.
So what are some of the other, I don't want to say trivia because it's not trivia.
Yeah.
What are some of the other cool things? Because we still have about 10 minutes left. So.
All right. Well,
and I think I've gotten through most of my questions. So.
One of my podcasts is, you've probably heard the term gerrymandering and gerrymander.
Yes.
I tell a story.
I remember learning about that in 6th grade.
Well, you can learn about it much quicker on my podcast.
Probably remember it better.
I keep pointing to the podcast room. That's why I'm pointing here.
Actually, it's that way.
I actually, you're right. I actually knew a guy named Roger Gary where I was growing up. He was the grandson or great-grandson or something of Elbridge Gerry.
Yeah.
And he told me, you do not pronounce it gerrymander, it's gerrymander.
Oh.
And he was insistent on it. And everybody, at least at that time in Linfield, all knew enough. You pronounce it the right way. Oh, okay. So I tell a story not only about where it came from, the cartoon drawing that
the
showed,
cartoon drawing is kind of what the
turned
only
somebody
thing I remember.
into a salamander and so forth. But I also tell the story about how to pronounce his name.
Oh.
So that was kind of a fun one. Another one I discovered, this happened in Linfield back during the Civil War, when there was the great recruitment on. They needed more and more soldiers as the war wore on. They set up recruitment camps around Boston, and they eventually they concentrated on 2, one in Hyde Park and then one in Linfield. And the town of Linfield back then probably had 800 people. It was very small, and the village of South Linfield within Linfield was even smaller. But it did have a railroad station, and it had a lake on Sundog Lake. So it became the place the state decided to build this temporary Civil War camp that lasted, I think, 3 years.
Wow.
And it has quite a history. Henry Wilson, who later became Vice President of the United States, was one of the people that set the camp up. He actually lived there for about 6 months. He was a senator at the time, but he went on to become Vice President. His Vice President lived in the town for a while, just a short time. In the town...
Whose Vice President was he?
Grant.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it was after the war.
Okay.
He was a senator at the time. He took a temporary commission as a colonel just for the recruitment, but he kept his Senate seat.
Oh, wow.
So then after the war, he was kind of rewarded with with the vice presidency. But it was kind of...
you could keep your job like that.
You're normally not supposed to. They actually had to have a special vote to allow him to keep the job. But he wasn't actually leading the soldiers. He was just there for the recruitment, but they gave him a colonelship. But anyway, there's this... So I tracked down what happened to the buildings. Most of them were tents, so they didn't last long. Okay. There was a hotel in the middle of it that burned down, but that had been commandeered for this camp. And then, from what I can tell, there's only one structure left from it. It was some sort of a building that they used for the headquarters. It's now a house moved into the other end of town.
Okay.
So it was kind of fun to find that.
Yeah. Wait, the house, they moved the house?
Yeah, the house was moved when
that's
the
wild.
big interchange of Route 1 and 128 was reconfigured back around 1959, 1960.
Okay.
Some of the houses were torn down, some of them were moved, and this was one of them that was actually moved down to the center of town.
Wow. And
I don't even know if the people who live there know the house's history. They may, but it was just a fun find.
Yeah. Well, speaking of like historical things, and when you were talking about, Civil War, and I was thinking, Castle Island. Not that it's the same war, but just I'm thinking,
right.
Like the structure, the fort.
Fort Independence, right?
Do you ever like visit historic places specifically with the goal to try to find those lesser known?
Yes. In fact, Castle Island is one of them.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Two things about Castle Island. One, it actually makes an appearance in today's podcast.
Oh.
A cameo appearance.
Have to go home
and
check it out.
But I've also heard the story, whether it's legend or not, I don't know. But Edgar Allan Poe was stationed there for a while.
Oh, okay.
And while he was there was this story at the time they thought was legend about this, I don't know if he's a captain or some officer anyway, was harassing one of the privates, and they ended up having a duel.
Ooh.
And this captain killed the private. And I guess it was all legal. I mean, that was just, they had a duel. But some of the underlings didn't like this, and they chained the captain into this alcove and walled him up down in the basement.
Oh, wow.
And of course, The Cask of Amontillado, written by Edgar Allan Poe, is very much that story. It's not a wartime story, but it's very much that story. And I think people thought it was legend until 1912, I think it was, when they were doing some renovating. A wall was taken down, and there's a guy in chains, a skeleton in chains on the wall.
Oh, wild.
So I've been over there to try to find out if that story's true. I don't really know, but it makes a nice story.
That still sounds pretty cool to figure it out.
Yeah.
Have you ever made a discovery where what has once legend, you've actually figured out, well, this is actually true?
Not exactly that, but my story on Lincoln Park is similar. Okay. It was not so much that everybody knew it as a legend. Nobody knew it at all.
Oh. Okay.
And I'm pretty much the person who discovered it.
Cool.
This park, this is the one that was trying to attract a Negro League baseball team, a black baseball team. It only existed from 1931 to 35 or 36, and it just disappeared. Almost nothing was written in the major dailies. There may be occasional references to Lincoln Park, and they didn't tell you where it was. They assumed you knew because this was a newspaper. And I did more. The only reason I knew about it is going back to my uncle that I had mentioned at the beginning. He was the secretary of the State Soccer Association, and he used to rent the park for the State Cup Championships back in the 1930s.
Okay.
So he had told me about it, and I was interested. Where is this place? And he kept. I think he might have.
Are you finding any photos of this?
No,
or?
absolutely no photos whatsoever. If anybody knows of one, let me know. I did find a map. I did find a Sanborn insurance map showing the park. And that's finally how I narrowed it down to exactly where it was, because I couldn't find anybody that knew. And even my uncle, he said it's near that big round building, the one that's now the Roundhouse Hotel.
Oh,
but he says he couldn't remember exactly which side it was on. He just remembers that.
Well, because it's a round building.
Right, there's no corners, But so I just dug and dug and dug. I remember one night at the library, I found this Sanborn insurance map, and there it is, Lincoln Park. It was like finding the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
It did exist. He was right. So from there, I was able to start piecing the other stories. I knew what was around the area, and I could just piece some of the newspaper articles I'd read about it, so I'd know how to reference it. So it wasn't a legend. It wasn't like I proved something true. It was I proved something that nobody even knew about it, that it existed. Yeah. And now it's funny how it's among baseball historians. It's matter of fact. Now people know where it is, but they weren't writing that before I found it. Yeah.
Like, wait, no, I did
that. That's right. Yeah. But that was kind of exciting.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
When you're piecing stuff together, how have you ever encountered where it might not be the same thing that you're piecing together, or maybe you're missing something that you don't draw the connection to? Does that make sense at all?
Maybe, if I'm getting you
Okay.
right. I did find that an early version of something was wrong. It was a minor point, but it was
Okay.
exactly wrong. In fact, it's the story that I put up today on the attack on the governor.
Okay.
There's this drawing of the incident, and it couldn't possibly have happened the way the drawing was. If you listen to all of the, if you put all of the court reports, all of the newspaper reports together, they all match, but the picture looks like this.
Oh, okay.
So I said, okay, this is backwards. But
Okay.
it was
Well, that is-
minor
that's
point, but it was still
right.
fun to find. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering, like, if you have, notes over here and notes over there and notes over there, and you're able to draw the connection between these two things. Have you ever like gone back later, going, "Oh, how did I ever miss that?"
Oh, I see. Okay, I missed your point.
Well, I didn't make it very well, so
Yeah. Not that it's coming to mind. I'll bet there's something out there that I'm just not thinking of. But you're probably right, because these stories are almost ongoing. Like even some of the podcasts I put up, I think I'll find other pieces to them
Right.
later on that weren't quite right.
But then, like, all of a sudden, it's like, "Whoa! Why didn't I make that connection earlier?"
Yeah. Well, here's
So you'll
one.
have to just come back.
Here's one.
Next
It's
time.
not
Okay.
exactly the same story, but I chaired our town's 350th anniversary back a few years ago.
Okay.
The town had always looked at the date May 29th as its birthday. And when I was doing, and I went along with that, I figured they'd all know better. And after I had been at this for a while, I was reading some old journals from the Massachusetts Archives, and it references June 10th. I'm thinking, okay, it's like 12 or 13 days different, 14
Yeah.
days, whatever. But I thought something isn't
Well, going
right
back
here.
350 years, maybe,
So I was talking to one of the older historians in town, and she said, oh, that's because of the change in the Julian versus the Gregorian calendar. And I bought it. I said, okay. But later, I found that wasn't the case at all. It was that the Massachusetts legislature, up until that day, in fact, was one body, one unicameral.
Okay.
And that's the day it split into an upper and lower chamber.
Oh.
So the upper chamber voted on it May 29th, but it wasn't until June 10th that the lower chamber voted on it. And everybody, including me, had missed that going through this. We'd seen the first one, and how did we miss that?
Exactly. Oh, that's pretty cool. Well, I'm glad that we ended on a good note, because we are out of time.
Ah, that went fast.
So, thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for
I'm
having
actually,
me.
going to start faithfully listening to the podcast instead of just here and there. And I can't wait for your next books to come out. No pressure. But thank you very much for joining me tonight. And I also want to thank everyone at home for tuning in this evening. I hope you have a newfound fascination for historic references in our wonderful area. And I will see you around town. Good night.